Now that we've got MongoDB set up and we have the Compass community tool set up in order to interact with our MongoDB MS so that we can create databases, create collections, and create documents all manually without having an actual application or API created yet. We're going to begin by really talking about what documents are. Documents are kind of the root object inside of a Mongo database. And that is because everything inside of a Mongo database is a collection of documents, and documents are that core element because documents are where data is stored. Now, if we think back to our screencasts on JavaScript, we remember that inside of JavaScript, pretty much every object that we deal with in JavaScript is going to be an object that forms what we call JSON, or the JavaScript object notation. And that, of course, begins with a curly brace, and then we have attributes, such as, let's go ahead and put some spaces in there. We've got like name. Let's make this a better example. Here we go. We've got ourselves name and the value that's associated with it, like Bob. And then we would have something like age. So that's another attribute. We'll say 35. And then we have another attribute. Maybe it's going to be eye color. It's going to be blue. And so on. And what we end up with is a JavaScript object literal, which is what this is right here. In other words, this syntax literally creates an object in memory when it gets executed in JavaScript. Now, with JavaScript object notation becoming extremely popular as JavaScript became a more and more popular front-end language for building front-end applications inside the browser, the JavaScript object notation became extremely popular for passing data to and from or across the internet. In other words, to and from a client and a server across the internet. We began to see these objects, or this syntax, being used to format data to be sent across the internet to and from client and server, or from a browser to an API. Well, with JavaScript object notation becoming extremely popular and being passed across the internet between APIs, web applications, and front ends developed in the browser, it was only natural that at some point this object notation also became popular in databases. Whereas up until MongoDB and the NoSQL database initiative, we really just had relational databases. And relational databases were pretty much just Excel files that held rows and columns of data that were interrelated one with another. Well, we're not going to go deep into relational databases. We're going to stay with the topic of NoSQL databases, specifically document databases, which is what MongoDB is. So with this particular syntax, MongoDB was created so that it had what we call BSON. Instead of JSON, it's BSON. But it pretty much follows the same kind of document structure as a JSON object or as a JavaScript object. And we can see that when we open up our Compass community and then we connect to our local instance of MongoDB. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to that. Now, we created, when we set up our MongoDB, we set up this thing called My First Database, and that was our first database. And then we added a collection because it was required that we have at least one collection when we created a database. So let's click on that and go into the collection. Now here you can see we have no documents yet. So let's pull up the documentation from Mongo on documents. Let's kind of look at what or how Mongo structures its documents. And we can see just how much it looks like JSON. And here we can read right here, it says MongoDB stores data records as BSON documents. BSON is a binary representation of JSON documents. So really, at its core, we have JSON documents, or JavaScript object notations, for objects that we are calling documents, and they get stored inside of MongoDB in a binary format, and that's where they call that, or that's why they call it BSON, is that it is a binary format of JSON. And so understanding regular JavaScript object notation and understanding how that data gets passed across the web between the clients and the servers, now we can pass the exact same objects that come from the UI all the way to the database and have it remain in the same format. To illustrate that, if we go back here to our diagram, this is the format we're using, which is JSON. So let's go ahead and note that, JSON. That is the format that we're using. And when we have our front end right here, we have our middle tier right here, and then we have our database over here. In the past, we would have a separate format of data that lived here in the browser, which most of the time was JavaScript or JSON, JavaScript objects. Then in the middle tier, we would have different things like XML or SOAP or SAML or a bunch of different kinds of formats or even binary. And then over here on this end, we would actually have tabular data that would fit into a relational database. So we actually had 3 different formats, and we would have to translate between each of these different layers in our application, translating that data as it moved between the different layers. So let's go ahead and identify those layers just so we can use this as a reference in the future. So here we've got our front end. And then we have our middle tier, which is usually our business logic. And then we have our database. Oops. Let's go ahead and database, or our persistence layer. And in the past, we're going to go ahead and do what was down here in the past, what I was just explaining, that we may have different formats of data that are being passed between the tiers. So here we may have had an object in the form of JavaScript objects. So that would be something like we have right up here. So it would be a object, name, value, key pair. And that would be the format of the data on this end. And then in the middle tier, we would have something like XML. So in order to translate this data right here to the middle tier, that data would have to be transformed into a new format. And that new format in the past was XML. So we would have something like this, an XML document. Inside of that XML document, we would then have a name object with the value Bob with a closing tag of name. And then we would have our closing XML tag. And it would look something like this. This, of course, is not 100% valid XML, but it would look something like this. And then that data would then have to be translated into a relational format, which would be tabular data. And that would look something like this, where we have a table that would refer to a person or a user. So let's say this is the user table. And then that table would have a column named name. Or actually, we would have an ID column and then a name column. And then under the ID would be the ID of whatever object that is. And then we would have the value Bob in here that would fit under that table. So we'd have tabular data. And we would have to have something in between all of these layers, or a part of the layer, that would then translate. So in the front end, before it was sent over to the middle tier, we would have to have a JSON or JavaScript to XML translator that would sit between these two layers and translate our JavaScript into XML. So let's go ahead and notate that. We got that translator that would then turn it into XML. And then again, we would have to have a translator on this side that would then translate our XML that we got in through a web service. It would have to be translated into tabular data to be stored in a relational database. And we would have just all these translators. So I'm going to go ahead and note these as translators. Right? So we'd have these translators. So you can see that it just kind of adds to the complexity of both our front end and our middle tier, in that we would have to have these translators that would take these different data formats and exchange them depending upon which direction the data is going. If it's going from the front end, we'd have to translate to XML, and then from the middle tier, we'd translate from XML into tabular information. And then going back the other direction, we would get tabular data back from the database. It would have to be translated into XML. That XML would then be sent across the internet, and then that XML would have to be translated into JavaScript objects again for use in the front end. Well, that was a pain. It was a real pain in the rear. So with the advent of JSON, or using the JavaScript object notation as an actual data format that could then be used between the front end and the middle tier, we then just had a translator sitting right here. In the past, there was a single translator right here that would then translate from JSON into tabular data. And that's what used to happen, because we could take this JavaScript, or this JSON, JavaScript object notation, and we could pass it directly from the front end to the middle tier without a translator. And that was when we were using relational databases as the backend. With the introduction of MongoDB, what ends up happening is that instead of having an additional translator right here, we now have a consistent data format that will go from the front end to the middle tier, and then from the middle tier directly into the database without any translation. And that is really what we gain when we use a MongoDB database, and then we use a JavaScript middle tier and a JavaScript front end. And that's where the MERN stack comes in. We're using Mongo as the database, Express as the middle tier, which is also written in JavaScript, and then React on the front end that is also written in JavaScript. Now we just have this direct flow of data in the exact same format from front end all the way to the database. And because we're using that same format, we can use it from the front all the way to the back end. So let's go back to our community edition right here, and let's insert a document manually. And you can see right here that we're following this key value pair format. And if we're going to follow our example, we've got an ID right here, which is the unique ID of this document. And then if we were going to follow our example, we would say name, the value would be Bob. And then we may have our email, and that would be test@test.com, and so on. And you can see how this just follows that object notation from JavaScript. And then when we insert that, we see that it continues to follow that same format, the key value pair format. And then that format, stored in binary inside of MongoDB, when it's pulled out of MongoDB, is sent back in a JSON format to the middle tier, and then from the middle tier onto the front end. Hopefully this helps you understand Mongo documents. Now the interesting thing about Mongo documents is that they actually don't have to follow the same format. Although I'm calling this my first collection, and although I put a user in here, the crazy thing that we're not used to when we're dealing with relational databases and we have tables that have very specific columns that require specific data, we can actually create documents that are not even the same and put them in the same collection. This is a nifty feature of MongoDB, but also can become a very big issue when it comes to keeping our data clean and keeping our data well formed and in neat collections that where the documents correspond to one another, which makes it easier to maintain. So it can be super flexible, but with flexibility comes issues, and then it can be highly structured, which of course makes it more rigid. So you have to decide what the balance is. But to exemplify this point, we have a user in there, and now I can create something completely different. So maybe we are going to store a comment. So maybe we've got a post ID, and maybe the ID of the post looks something like that. And then we have a comment text. And I really like how crazy documents can be. We can insert that. And here we have a collection called My First Collection, yet it owns a user as well as a comment for a blog post. You can see how this could become extremely confusing. And in order to make sure that we don't do stuff like this in our database and we keep our data separate and we keep all the documents that are related in the same collection, that's where we start to begin to use different patterns and different third-party tools in order to begin to create a well-structured database rather than a completely random database. And that's where Mongoose comes in, which is a JavaScript library that we can use inside of our web application to create well-formed collections and also well-validated documents that fit within those collections and only have related data in those collections. We'll see how to do that in a little bit. So hopefully this helps you understand documents inside of MongoDB.